Tonight, a pause in a war that has killed more than 2,000 people here in Lebanon. The US brokered deal aims to halt fire between Israel and Hezbollah for 10 days after weeks of conflict that's raged alongside the war in Iran. It's due to take effect at midnight local time, 10 p.m. in the UK, a little under an hour from now. President Trump sees it as another war he's solving.
Today they're going to be having a ceasefire, and that'll include Hezbollah, and I think it could be number 10 for me.
And I'm Barbara Sarah in London. Also tonight, a special report from inside Cuba. We see how a nation is being starved of fuel, power and food, strangled by a US blockade of its energy lifelines.
All of Cuba have had problems with power shortages for a long time now, but everyone who lives here tells us it's getting worse since the fuel blockade imposed by President Trump on Cuba has really kicked in.
Stuart Ramsey tells us the reality of life for people whose government is powerless to provide power.
Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Yalda Hakim in Beirut, a city that is tonight absorbing the news that a 10-day ceasefire is due to take effect in less than an hour. The US says Lebanon's government has agreed to prevent Hezbollah and other armed groups in its territory from attacking Israel. The truce was announced by Donald Trump in social media posts, adding that he'll invite Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Lebanese President Joseph Aoun to the White House for talks. But this sentence also stood out to me. Trump wrote, "It's been my honor to solve 9 wars across the world, and this will be my 10th, so let's get it done." The conflict here was ignited by the war in Iran, which the US president and Israel started. Israeli forces also occupy parts of southern Lebanon, where they earlier destroyed another major bridge on a day diplomats sought to bridge gaps to secure the ceasefire. And Lebanon is still grappling with the death and destruction of Israel's biggest single bombardment of the war last week, a day people here are calling Black Wednesday. Our Middle East correspondent, Adam Parsons, is in Jerusalem. We'll hear from him shortly. But first, let's go to our US correspondent, David Blevins, who joins us live from Washington. And David, it's been a difficult 6 weeks for the US president just dealing with the war in Iran. And although many people thought this country was part of a ceasefire deal last Wednesday, it wasn't. The death and destruction continued. But for the US president, this is a moment that he will see as a win.
That's absolutely right, Yalda. I think it's important to remember the context that President Trump is claiming victory for bringing about an end to a war between Israel and Hezbollah that really was only reignited by his decision to go to war against Iran. And it's a very vague ceasefire announced on Truth Social. We don't know how it's going to play out on the ground. Will Hezbollah adhere to it or not? The president says Lebanon will make sure Hezbollah does. But of course, there's no history of Lebanon having done that in the past. But the president has never allowed the reality, shall we say, to get in the way of the optics. So he is claiming this as a big deal, a foreign policy win when he really needs one. He's framing himself yet again, as you point out, as the peacemaker, suggesting this might be the 10th war he has ended. And there may even be some domestic capital in this for him, because he can say to the American people, my policy of peace through strength is working, despite the fact that many of his UK and European allies fear he is only bringing about peace by waging war, or by threatening war across the Middle East. And that's why a short time ago, just before the president left the White House for Las Vegas, I asked him how he thought this ceasefire would be perceived on the other side of the Atlantic.
What message do you think the ceasefire in Lebanon sends to the UK and other European allies who chose not to get involved in the war?
Well, you know, we spend trillions and trillions of dollars on NATO, and when I asked them to get involved on a much smaller situation, which is Hormuz and Iran, they weren't there for us. Remember what I said. They weren't there. None of them. They weren't there. So we were there on Ukraine. I mean, we shouldn't have been. It would have never happened if I were president. But nevertheless, when they've had problems over the years, we were there. when we asked them to get involved on a very minor skirmish by comparison to what it could be, they weren't there. So I don't think they'd be there for a large skirmish, and therefore I think they've got themselves a problem.
Now, we all know that the big highlight of his first term as president in terms of foreign policy was the Abraham Accords, an attempt to normalise relations between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. He's often talked about his desire to extend that. This evening, he's been boasting about the fact that it was his administration that brought together the Lebanese and Israeli governments at ambassadorial level for the first time in more than 30 years this week in Washington. And now he's talking about the potential of bringing together the Lebanese President and the Israeli Prime Minister at the White House for the first time in more than 40 years. So it's pretty clear he has the legacy of his second term now in his sights too.
David, as always, thank you so much for bringing us up to date. Let's go straight to our Middle East correspondent, Adam Parsons, who joins us live now. And Adam, this ceasefire is likely to get into effect in about under an hour's time. And there are some last-minute fires from both sides being launched. We understand that Hezbollah has launched some rockets on northern Israel in the last half an hour or so.
Yes, it has. Hezbollah has launched a number of attacks over the past hour, including one which appears to have caused at least one casualty. And I can tell you in the last couple of minutes, we've heard that the Israeli military has responded by launching its own attacks to try to take out those Hezbollah rocket launches. So the military conflict continues on the border. It may well carry right up until midnight. The question then is what happens, and will that ceasefire be respected? And the indications are that, yes, it will. Let's be clear, it's a 10-day ceasefire. This is not a comprehensive peace deal. It's a ceasefire. And on both sides, I think, of it, the primary actors, in other words, the Israeli military and Hezbollah, I think there's reluctance, but particularly, I have to say, from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, but he is being squeezed by Donald Trump. Hezbollah is being ordered by Iran. And because both effectively of those guarantors, Iran and the United States, want the ceasefire to hold, then probably it will. Hezbollah has said that it retains the right to resist. It is furious that the Israeli military is continuing to occupy a really, really chunky area of southern Lebanon. The Israelis say it has to hold on to that because it's a buffer zone, and I'm sure it will point up to the fact that right up to the last minute, Hezbollah is firing rockets into northern Israel. So this ceasefire won't see Israeli troops withdrawing from southern Lebanon. It's not going to happen. I think everyone will just have to live with the status quo. Effectively, Yalda, this is a freeze, as in the war stops here, the guns are laid down. I think we should expect also, as always happens with ceasefires, that there will probably be a couple of slip-ups along the way. There's a lot of heavily armed, inexperienced young soldiers there. So there's going to be, as there always are, there's going to be mistakes. There will be weapons discharged. And I think, again, it will be down to Israel, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Iran and America, and probably the United Nations to ensure that those things don't escalate. But there's a few things to take away from this. One is that I think Israel will now pressure America for an even more all-encompassing peace deal, and it will say, well, you now have to confront Hezbollah. You have to do a peace deal that stops Iran funding Hezbollah as well as Hamas and the Houthis. Interesting, I thought that Netanyahu in his statement today talked about a fundamental requirement being that Hezbollah is disarmed rather than disbanded. I think the other thing that Israel will look for is some sort of structure of a permanent ceasefire. And from their perspective, that may well mean having the military right to either continue occupying or to enter that southern zone. And of course, as we all know, the intractable problem here is that Hezbollah has such huge military might, almost certainly more military power than the Lebanese army itself. And everyone will have to tread on eggshells, diplomatically speaking, because there is a huge fear, as you well know, because you're sitting there now, that in Beirut people fear the prospect of a civil war. And again, in Israel, they are very, very well aware of the danger of a civil war breaking out again on that northern frontier. So there are so many variables around this, not least the reluctance of Netanyahu to embrace this ceasefire in the first place. And yet, if a deal were to be done, if Iran were to do a deal on enrichment, on sanctions with the United States, and on funding these proxies, then that could be transformative. Trump talks about getting a deal done in Islamabad. I've spoken to others who think this will take months and months, and that there's no guarantee it could even come off. But if it did, what a prospect that would be.
Adam, as always, thanks so much for all of your reporting and analysis there. Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Kamal Shahadi, Lebanon's Minister of Displaced, which has grown by more than 1 million in the last month. And you've had quite a task on your hands, Minister. A fifth of the country's population has been displaced. But I just want you to react to this ceasefire that has been announced by the US President and is likely to come into effect in the next hour.
Well, this is the first breakthrough in the government's diplomatic initiative. When this government was formed, we decided that we wanted the state, the government, to have monopoly over weapons. We wanted to collect all the weapons from Hezbollah so that wars like the one that started on the 2nd of March did not happen anymore. And we started collecting the weapons from Hezbollah. But we also chose a diplomatic route. We are aware that only through an agreement with guarantees from the United States and the international community can we control hostilities on both sides of the border so that Israel can live at peace and Lebanon can live at peace. That has been the objective of this government. And what we have done today, we've heard from the President Trump. We've also heard from the Israeli Prime Minister. But based on the Lebanese President's initiative, this diplomatic breakthrough today has led to this announcement, the announcement of a ceasefire. This has come 2 days after the meeting that took place in Washington. I think this is a day to it's an important breakthrough, but we have to make sure that the details of the ceasefire are worked out and implemented.
I want to ask about what Hezbollah has said in the last couple of hours. They've said they have every right to respond for as long as Israel is on Lebanese territory. They want the Israeli forces, the IDF, off Lebanese territory. What would you say to them in this moment?
I would say the same thing we've been saying, that Hezbollah's weapons are a liability to the Lebanese. They're not an asset. They have not helped. They have not brought security. Quite the contrary. They got Lebanon involved in the last 2 years in 2 wars, the Gaza war and now the Iran war. Iran has used Hezbollah as a pawn in its fight with Israel and the United States. What we are doing here is disentangling Lebanon from the regional conflicts. Lebanon has paid a very high price for the Arab-Israeli conflict, for Syrian hegemony and its desire to control the pieces on the chessboard, for the Palestinian aspirations, and we've also paid a very high price for the Iranian ambitions in the region. No more. What this government is saying is we are concerned about Lebanese interests and we will see it through. We want to make sure that Lebanon does not continue to be a battlefield for other people's problems. We have our own agenda. We have to look after our people, and we can secure our people with the Lebanese armed forces and through the political and diplomatic initiatives and our web of friendships across the world.
Do you think you'll get the time and the support that you need? Because I continue to speak to Lebanese ministers who say, we can and we will disarm Hezbollah, we need time. But if you see these flare-ups constantly, is that giving you, the government, the space and the support from Israel, from the United States, to do what you want to do, which is disarm and decommission Hezbollah?
It's not enough. No, it doesn't help, of course, because the more Israel attacks Hezbollah and Hezbollah targets, the more it feeds into the narrative that Hezbollah is pushing, that Israel is an unbounded a hegemon. They want to control the region. They want to control Lebanon. And I think it's clear that we have to give diplomacy a chance. And so what we're looking for is to have a timetable that has reciprocal moves from Lebanon and from Israel to build confidence and to show that we are able and that we will disarm Hezbollah, we will decommission Hezbollah, and that just like other militias were disbanded and their weapons collected after the civil war in 1989-90, that the same thing will happen with Hezbollah, and this time Iran should be neutralized from interfering in Lebanese affairs. That is what I think should happen from the international community, and it's very important that the US, Europe, the Gulf countries stay focused on this objective. We have to take care of Hezbollah. It's an internal problem, but they have to also take care of Iran.
There is no denying that Iran putting pressure on the United States, saying that there will be no ceasefire if Lebanon is not included in that ceasefire. Is this deal Lebanon's deal, or is it something that the Iranian regime were responsible for?
I think this is clearly a Lebanon deal. This is the result of the Lebanese initiative. We were criticized for doing this by Hezbollah and by Iran. And some of the Lebanese politicians were attacked violently by the Iranian media because Hezbollah and Iran want to keep the Lebanese card in Iranian hands. What this government has succeeded in doing is to separate the two. Of course, a de-escalation between Iran and the US will have beneficial effects on Lebanon, and we welcome a de-escalation and a cessation of hostilities all over the world, not just in the Middle East, not just in the Gulf. But this is an achievement of the Lebanese Republic. The Islamic Republic of Iran, using Hezbollah, started this war on March 2nd. It's only the Republic of Lebanon that can bring it to an end by having a credible policy, a credible timetable, and a Lebanese armed forces that are implementing the agreement that we will reach.
Do you think that you will be able to strengthen the Lebanese armed forces? Because right now they're not in a position, in the kind of position that you're talking about, to be able to do what you are suggesting.
I don't agree with that, if I may, Yalda. I think they have the capability and they have the political support to do it. They need more funding, they need more resources, they need more weapons. Yes, that's true. And I think this is something that's going to materialize. We have to take the first step, show the world that we are actually collecting the weapons from Hezbollah. And I think there will be support forthcoming, as we were promised, not just from the Gulf countries, Lebanon's friends in the Gulf, but also from the West, from the US and Europe.
The other issue, of course, which is part of your file, is the displacement. Over a million people. I mean, we throw these numbers around, but this is such a huge number of people.
That's a huge person.
And tens of thousands of homes in the south destroyed. Today, a critical bridge was also destroyed by the IDF. How are these people going to go back home? And they are in a hurry to return back home. Are they even able to at this moment?
They're not able to go at this point. They're able to... if the ceasefire persists, they will be able to go and visit their homes. However, this is a challenge of catastrophic proportions. 1,200,000 Lebanese have been made homeless. 40,000 homes have been destroyed. Hundreds of schools, of municipalities, public spaces have been devastated. I think there's a big challenge which we will have to face over the next 5 to 10 years. This is not something we're going to recover from rapidly. Fortunately, this government is organized, dedicated. In fact, the whole of government is focused on supporting the displaced, the internally displaced persons, and the whole of government is focused on finding a political path out of this war so that we resolve this once and for all.
How will you deal with the fact that Israeli forces remain on Lebanese territory?
Lebanon has made it clear we will not accept any long-term stay. Any solution has to include total Israeli withdrawal from all Lebanese territory. Not 1 inch from Lebanon is going to be given up. We will insist on that, and I think the US and Israel have said they have no territorial ambitions. Israel has said that. The US has passed on the same message repeatedly, that Israel does not have any territorial ambitions in Lebanon. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to get to a solution.
Do you trust and believe that?
It's not about trust. It's about coming up with a mechanism that can be verified. And I'm reminded of President Reagan's phrase when he was talking to Gorbachev about nuclear disarmament: trust but verify. The Israelis want that, we want that. We have to start with a minimum modicum of trust to get to an agreement, but then we have to verify that both sides are implementing this, which is why I refer to a step-by-step reciprocal moves, starting with confidence-building measures, moving on to more effective measures. That's how we're going to do this. It's going to take some time, but I think once we get started, I think we will get the support we need to foot.
Dr. Shahadi, really grateful for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yalda.
Thank you. Well, we've just heard, as I said, in the last hour or so, that there is going to be a ceasefire that will take effect across this nation from about 10 p.m. UK time. So that is in about 40 minutes time. Already we are seeing some last-minute airstrikes and rockets and drones being launched on northern Israel, as well as on different parts of Lebanon. So we'll have to wait and see whether this ceasefire holds, and we will be monitoring all the developments here. But for now, Barbara, back to you in the studio.
Yalda, thank you. And coming up next on The World, we'll have a special report from our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, on the ground in Cuba, where people are living through the devastating consequences of President Trump's blockade.
I urge you not to look away. If Hamas hands the hostages over, they will end this conflict. The world has been watching. Good to see you again. How are you? Did she say how he was?
The conditions are awful.
The jets were ordered to come back.
Historic day here today. How will you respond if India does launch airstrikes?
They'll be all out to war.
I'm just going to put some body armor on. I'm Yalda Hakim.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist... Hi, darling.
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
...is being a Sky News journalist. You said to people, I'm not coming back for more, but you have come back for more. Well, let's kick off and make a statement. What can our Prime Minister say to you to not impose tariffs? He's coming out! What more do you need?
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We're in an area that's just been reclaimed
Mr. Zuma, Sky News. People are directly protesting. The whole neighborhood is rallied around her. It's been impenetrable to journalists over the last 2 years of war in Sudan. I've been waiting for this for 2 years. It doesn't feel like a big homecoming. It was never going to be pretty. War isn't pretty.
Before President Trump's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, there was his effective blockade of Cuba. He is starving the Caribbean nation of fuel in a maximum pressure campaign to bring down the island's communist government and, perhaps in his words, to take Cuba. But as Sky News has seen inside the country, it's the people who are suffering most. The US and Cuba have been foes ever since the island's communist revolution in the 1950s, when American economic embargoes began. President Trump went further in January, signing an executive order threatening countries that supply oil to Cuba with tariffs. Cuba imports 60% of its fuel from Russia, Mexico and Venezuela. The de facto blockade means petrol and diesel are now reduced to a trickle. There are regular blackouts, sometimes lasting an entire week, from a collapsing national power grid. Food shortages are tragically routine, with hours-long queues for even the basics. And the UN says 1 million people are dependent on water trucking, which of course is severely constrained by the lack of diesel. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, reports now from the Cuban capital, Havana.
The center of Havana is plunged into darkness once again. The Cuban government doesn't have enough oil to keep its power grid working. It has no choice but to switch it off. Even the capital can be no longer spared. If there are lights, they come from car batteries or saved-up solar energy. Remember, these are some of Havana's main districts. They've never been deprived of electricity like this before. A Cuba powerless to provide its people with power. Illuminated by headlights or with torches, people prepare for an early night. When the night falls now, normal life is suspended. Just because it's daylight doesn't mean there's power. Some of the power cuts last for days at a time. Cuba is into its 4th month since Donald Trump's government imposed a blockade of all fuel to the country. The blockade doesn't just affect power. It affects every facet of life here, and it's unraveling faster than anyone predicted. There's a growing food shortage now, and people are desperate. Through rubbish bins, they search for anything of value and anything worth eating. Some collected in bags, slowly working their way through the mound of rubbish, seeking out discarded fruit and vegetables rotting beneath the blistering sun, sifting out what they can scavenge from here. These aren't homeless people, they're desperate people. Others can't wait, inspecting the food, then eating it. It's that desperate. There's been incredible poverty here in Cuba for a long time, but this type of open, desperate need hasn't existed here for many years. And the streets of the capital don't usually look like this. What people have been telling me is that the streets of Havana are famous for always being really clean, even though the people are really poor. But things have got worse, and as a lady was just explaining to me, this is here because the normal refuse people, the bin men, haven't got petrol to actually come and pick up the rubbish. So I've passed lots of street corners and it's like this. Hours-long queues form outside barely functioning government-controlled bakeries. They're limited to 1 piece of bread per person when there is any to be had. We found that the government's bodega stores that once provided cheap essentials like rice and cooking oil are basically shut or empty. Barely anything on the shelves. Pharmacies as well have just empty shelves. This one appears to be open, but it seems there's virtually nothing in stock.
Please help me with 1 milk here.
On the street, a man approached me, asking for paracetamol.
I'm an English teacher.
Yeah.
I teach a teenager in high school. But we have very few possibilities to buy new jobs, because the new market is, we can't afford. I mean, the people who live like me, like a wage, my income is 2,500 pesos like a teacher, and I can't afford to buy a new job.
As the Cuban government struggles to cope with this crisis, it's fallen on charities to provide some help. And the community of Santa Gidio Charity is now trying to feed a growing number of the most vulnerable. The elderly and the homeless line up for pasta. Meals are dished up by volunteers 3 times a week. Well, the statistics vary, but somewhere between 72% and 90% of people in Cuba live in extreme poverty. And about 3/4 say that they miss at least one meal a day because they simply can't afford to buy the food. They just haven't any ways of getting to it. For these people, the most vulnerable in society, this is the absolute lifeline. This is possibly the only proper meal they're going to get today for certain, but maybe for large parts of the rest of the week. The charity's director, Inares Suarez Cardenas, says the crisis is getting worse and they're being asked to provide more and more across society. The US blockade, she says, is pushing Cuba over the edge.
La situación de combustible inmoviliza.
The fuel situation paralyzes you. You can't move around. It limits you to a large degree. There are many things that need fuel to function, and we don't have it, so we are practically paralyzed. Many shelters, for example, have had to close because they don't have the means to operate.
Han tenido que cerrar porque no tienen cómo.
The tourism industry that brought billions of dollars of foreign currency into the country has dwindled. The once bustling tourist centres in Havana are virtually empty. There are few customers left to buy from the tourist shops and restaurants. The people of Cuba find themselves in the midst of an economic crisis that is worsening by the day. Years of government mismanagement combined with years of sanctions have left Cuba ill-prepared for the effects of President Trump's oil blockade. This is economic warfare every bit as destructive to life here as bombs and bullets would be. Crucial fuel supplies from Venezuela and Mexico have stopped on Trump's orders. A single Russian oil tanker has made it to Cuba in recent weeks, but that is it for the year so far. There's little traffic on Cuba's motorways. There's little fuel to be had, so nobody moves unless it's absolutely essential. We travelled a couple of hours outside the capital, Havana, mainly passing horse-drawn carts or slow-moving motorcycles and scooters. Without power or fuel, Cuba's already weak economy is floundering. This is a farming community in the region of Pinar del Rio, the centre of tobacco production and Cuban cigars. This community is typical of rural Cuba. There's little going on, most people are poor, and there's virtually no electricity. When we arrived, the power cut was already 2 days old. At sunset, many climb onto their rooftops looking for signal, though there is barely any. People tell us communicating with family and friends is often impossible these days. Others prepare charcoal fires to cook dinner for their families. Nobody relies on electric ovens anymore. As the night falls, battery-powered lights flicker on in the midst of a general blackout. Row after row of apartment blocks shrouded in darkness. It will stay like this until sunrise. Right, communities like this one across the whole of Cuba have had problems with power shortages for a long time now, but everyone who lives here tells us it's getting worse since the fuel blockade imposed by President Trump on Cuba has really kicked in. And it affects all of their lives, right? So there's electricity, there's no heating, lighting and to be seen, there's no telecommunications. The pumps that push water around mean there's no running water. And this community is a farming community. They can't afford the fuel to get to the fields to do their farming, and they can't afford to run the farming equipment. The reality of life during this fuel blockade is summed up by the darkness, by the grinding monotony of living without the appliances of modern life. In many ways, Cuba goes back in time every single night. I'd invite you to come and meet a family who live in this apartment block. Some of them have lights. It's solar power or batteries that they've got. They're on about the 3rd floor, I think, of this apartment. This is their electricity meters. They're not doing anything. Eventually, they're completely stationary. There's no power on at all. And they can often go days without power here. But we're going to come up and see what life's like. Oscar is a physics and maths teacher. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he's rigged up a system to keep the lights on at home. It's a short-term fix, but it's effective. Oscar and his wife Lise, an English teacher, live here with their son. Oscar takes home about £10 a month as a teacher. All government wages are poor, so he holds down 3 other jobs to try to make ends meet. They're not happy with their lives, but they don't see Donald Trump as their saviour. They prefer Cuba to do better, and the American blockade is making things worse.
Before the Trump administration, we had problems, but this has been worse, much worse in every way. Transportation, growing food, the blackouts have also increased. It's very difficult to keep food in the refrigerator. I have to buy food every day. Do you see what I mean? So it's been a lot harder, like never before, a lot worse.
In another apartment, Janet prepares the charcoal to make her dinner for the evening with the help of the light of a torch. She's a paediatric physiotherapist and lives alone in her 2-bedroom flat. Much of her extended family live in the blocks around her, in the town. Getting by is just a way of life for Jeanette. She'd like more, but there isn't more. And she, like so many Cubans we've met, are scared about the future and afraid about what may happen to her country. Donald Trump says he wants to bring about huge changes in Cuba, that the blockade is to try and bring about those changes. Do people in Cuba resent this interference?
In the end, it's the people who have to endure the consequences of any change. Hardship has increased, and it's us who are suffering day by day.
By morning, the community slowly awakes. Another night without power gives way to another day without power. It's relentless. Cuba's chronic mismanagement and the neglect of infrastructure over decades contributes to this situation. But years of US sanctions and President Trump's current oil blockade are making the problems in Cuba more acute now. After Venezuela and Iran, President Trump says Cuba is next. Nobody here knows what next means, or whether it will make things even worse, if that is possible.
And Stuart is with me now. Stuart, in your piece, it's really obvious just the impact that this is having on ordinary people.
It is, and I think it's much worse than many people probably expected, and how quickly it's taken. It began at the beginning of the year, this oil blockade. Cuba is incredibly needing of oil, but it's not just about a lack of power. It affects all of society, and it's literally falling apart. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but it's quite something to see. So you've got a massive Havana, massive capital city, mainly in darkness. You've got the regions that are in darkness a lot of the time. Everything is breaking down, and it's moving really, really quickly. And I think most people accept on both sides of the argument of whether there's mismanagement in Cuba and whether there should be changes, etc. But I think a lot of people are beginning to accept that you can't expect people to live like this because it is really quite incredibly unfair. But the blockade is in place and President Trump says it's going to stay there because he wants to make changes.
Well, President Trump also said that once the whole Iran thing wraps up, he might, in his words, take Cuba. So how likely do you think it is that when Iran, and we're seeing these very tenuous ceasefires, but how likely do you think that military action will happen?
He's made it clear that it is next on the list after the Middle East is sorted and Venezuela, which he believes is sort of sorted already. There is a massive concern amongst the Cuban people that it will be military action. But we're not quite sure what that means, and what exactly the sort of change that they want. We're not absolutely clear. At the moment, there is definitely negotiation taking place between the Cuban government and members of the Castro family and President Trump's team. What that amounts to, where it goes, we do not know. The effect, though, is an awful lot of fear. And he's saying, as he indicated, it could be military action. I'm not sure whether that's likely, but certainly for the people who are living the way they are now, something needs to change.
And Stuart, briefly, what is Russia's role in all of this?
So Russia has been able to get one ship in. A lot of the people I was talking to in Cuba were saying that the fall of the Soviet Union that supported Cuba, it gave them everything they had, was one of the big crises of its time. The second one was COVID, absolute disaster for Cuba, and now they're saying this one is actually worse than all of them together. Russia is playing a part in this. The fact they were able to get that ship in there, they are supportive of the government. Who knows if there's back-channel conversations taking place between Moscow and Washington? We don't know.
Stuart, thank you very much. And, of course, a longer version of your report is available online. Stuart, thank you. And we're going to have more on this shortly. I'll be speaking to a former top U.S. diplomat who was part of the rapprochement efforts with Cuba under Barack Obama.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News presenter?
Perfect.
Let's bring you some breaking news. Being a Sky News presenter. I began by asking,
thank you so much,
trusting us to tell her story. The battle for number 10. Sky News has been given exclusive access. Let me give you a sneak peek. It was the day those present would never forget. Why did you decide to open up and tell your story?
Welcome back, and let's go back to one of our top stories, and that is President Trump's effective blockade of Cuba. I'm joined now by Jeffrey De Laurentiis, who served as acting ambassador to Cuba during the Obama administration. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. And now, listening to the rhetoric escalate between both the Cuban government and President Trump, how likely do you think it is that we are going to see some kind of military intervention?
Well, up until very recently, I had thought that military reaction would be quite remote, but I'm feeling now perhaps it's a little less remote. Several reasons for that. There have been media reports that the Pentagon is ramping up planning for some sort of possible action, either because the White House requested it or because they're doing some contingency planning to prepare should such a request come. I'm also seeing reports that a number of people are raising this notion that Cubans are fighting with the Russians in Ukraine. This hasn't been mentioned really before, and it strikes me as perhaps part of a foundation to justify some more aggressive action. We've seen a recent poll that suggests that a vast majority of Cuban Americans want to see some sort of military action. And then, of course, President Trump made this comment that he wants to stop by Cuba after we finish with Iran. And so I would have to assume that folks are thinking about it more than they have before.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump's exact words were he's going to take Cuba next. Now, obviously, you were a diplomat in Cuba at the time when there was a reestablishment of relations between the U.S. and Cuba. It seems like a very long time ago. Just talk us through what the reasoning for that rapprochement was and what you make of Donald Trump's strategy now.
Well, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, of course, the idea was that Cuba was beginning to reform economically. We wanted to be a part of that reform effort and create an environment where that would more likely happen and develop. Unfortunately, that was all cut short when President Trump was elected the first time and canceled everything that Obama and the rest of us had tried to move forward. In terms of the strategy now, initially I thought they were looking to generate some sort of Venezuela replay. But I think in Cuba, it's going to be much more complicated to accomplish. Very different country, very different political system. You have a one-party communist state for 57 years, a lot of ideological cohesion still, certainly among the powers in Cuba, Venezuela, huge civil society, political opposition, large private sector, had been a democracy for many, many years. So I think it's very different. And the other complicating factor probably is the strong views of one of President Trump's strongest constituencies, supporters, and that's Cuban Americans in South Florida, who I don't think would be satisfied with what happened in Venezuela to happen in Cuba.
I mean, we're seeing the U.S. now be involved, of course, with Iran, a war that some people accuse the president of not quite having thought through when it comes to the unintended consequences of that attack. What do you think could be the unintended consequences of military action in Cuba?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have a great answer, but my sense is that the Cubans, certainly, again, the Cubans who hold power, are going to react more like the Iranians than the Venezuelans. So I think it's going to be pretty sticky. They will, the Cuban president, I believe today or maybe yesterday, again, talked about the fact that they're preparing for military action. So it could be a complicated quagmire. The other possibility, of course, is some sort of mass migration. Cuba is only 90 miles from U.S. shores, and that's been a reaction in the past to various crises. So I would think that, given the fact that the U.S. government has most of the cards here, that they would try and negotiate before contemplating something as messy and unnecessary as military action.
I don't know whether you managed to watch our correspondent Stuart Ramsey's report in Cuba, but it really showed the impact of the blockade on the civilian population. You obviously spent a long time in Cuba. You must know how people are living now, the impact that that blockade is having on them. I'm just wondering how you feel about a country that you obviously spent so much time in.
Look, I spent 8 years of my professional, my diplomatic life in Cuba at 3 different occasions. Stuart Ramsey's piece was very powerful because what does it show? That ultimately the victims here are the Cuban people. Now, I have to be clear, the humanitarian crisis in Cuba, you know, the responsibility rests at the feet of the government. They've refused to reform, and they just haven't been able to manage the economy. But the oil embargo, if you will, some have called it a blockade by the U.S., of course, exacerbates that significantly. And frankly, I'm very uncomfortable with this notion that the United States is using humanitarian suffering as an agent for political change. This from a country that has been the champion of humanitarian assistance all over the world. I just find it really difficult to grasp. And again, the U.S. government has the cards. They should be negotiating and not trying to starve the Cuban people to death.
Jeffrey De Laurentiis, who served as acting ambassador to Cuba during the Obama administration. Sir, we really appreciate you sharing your views with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're watching The World. Coming up, we're going to go back to Yalda Hakim in Beirut as the minutes tick down to the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire taking effect at 10 p.m. UK time.